Thank you, Sandy. So, two things that I want to start with. First is like a brief introduction about me and why I'm telling you this stuff. And then second, I want to I want to make it very clear what I'm not doing tonight and what I'm doing. Because this is, like, the subject I'm trying to capture is enormous. It's technically infinite, the thing I'm trying to capture. And so I want to make it perfectly clear what it is I'm doing and what I'm not doing. So as Sandy mentioned, I went to school studying philosophy and religion. And the first thing I went to school for originally, I wanted to study psychology. So I thought it was awesome. I wanted to know how the brain worked. I wanted to know the relationship between the mind and the body. And I thought psychology was the way to go. And so I was all lined up to go to work in a sleep lab at UC Berkeley. That was the plan. And I hated it. So psychology, unless you're at the very cutting edge of it, it's just a mess. And so I started studying philosophy, and I realized that it was like the real questions that I wanted to answer were baked into philosophy. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that the concept of religious experience and mystical experiences just gets completely overlooked, except for in a very specific discipline of philosophy. So I started studying that. And I ended up signing a religion major so that I could really dive into that set of literature. And so the capstone paper that I wrote on that subject provides the majority of the material for what I'm going to share with you tonight. So, first thing is walking through some of the things that I might be talking about and all the things that I won't be talking about. Because the ways that we could have a mystical or religious experience are infinite, right? They can happen anytime, anywhere, to anyone. But, and this is where science is really amazing, these statistical models, they give us information about when these kinds of experiences are more likely. And so the things that I'm going to focus on here tonight are the times when it seems like there's a disproportionate amount of mystical experiences. And so I have this list here that I wrote down, and I have to back up for just a moment. I had this long debate with myself as to whether I should have a PowerPoint and give you guys some images and quotes and all of that, and I decided that I'm just going to just throw information at you instead of trying to force you to take in a specific set of information and hope that whatever I'm throwing at you kind of sticks. So this is all very deliberate. So there's a couple categories that I want to identify and then explicitly rule out so that when I'm talking about mystical experiences, you know exactly what I mean. So there's a category of experiences that emerge as a result of ritual, as a result of ceremony, and as a result of dance that are important. They occur, they're important to culture, they're important to people, but we have very little scientific evidence around that category of mystical experiences. So I understand it's important, but I'm not going there today. There's another whole category of mystical experiences that are a product of renunciation or deprivation in some way, like so extreme fasting or extreme forms of isolation, going for long walks in the desert, that kind of thing. And I'm not going there either. Because, and this is the key part, we don't have good measurements for that stuff. Right? We can't talk about that statistically. And that's where I want to go tonight, is like just the things that I want to focus on are stuff that we've nailed down with math, which isn't to say that that's the only thing that exists, but it's something. Because those kinds of experiences we know almost nothing about from the scientific frame of mind. That's not to say that that's the only way to look at it, but it's saying something. And there's one other category that I have to rule out, which has to do with when you are exposed to something in the environment that is extreme. So there are people who have mystical experiences as a result of being exposed to a sunset or walks in the woods, stuff like that. Not talking about those either. As important as that stuff is, like, I have to put some boundaries around this idea if we're going to actually talk about it. So, with all of that said, and I'm removing all of that over to the side, what am I going to talk about tonight? I'm going to talk about what occurs in more than 80% of cases where people are having near-death experiences. I'm going to talk about the results of certain experiments done in the late 80s, early 90s with magnetic impulses on people's brains in the lab. And I'm going to talk about two different sets of studies that were done with chemicals. One was psilocybin, which I think is unbelievably useful. The information from that is really cool. And the other stuff, if I have time for it, will be Timothy Leary's work, which went into LSD and the results that he drew from that. So the main thing that I'm talking about tonight is the mystical experiences that have been measured in a laboratory setting. Nothing else. Everything outside of that context is important, worth paying attention to, worth studying another time. So first, I want to talk about the relationship between the temporal lobe in the brain and these mystical experiences. And the temporal lobe is so radically important for this field of study. And so I'm going to describe it in a couple different ways, and I hopefully it leaves you with something useful. So the first one, the word temporal. It has two specific definitions. One refers to time, like something is in time, and the other has to do with in the world. And both of those definitions are totally relevant and clue you in to what happens in that part of the brain. And the second thing that's worth paying attention to is that the temporal lobe is huge. It's not a little thing. It's like saying, oh, it's in aisle 5 at the grocery store. It's like, okay, where in aisle 5 are we talking about? But it's like, we have to talk about the whole thing as a unit because in the lab, they've measured stimulation and activity as a result of that entire place. Like, they're just sending magnetic signals into the whole thing, at least in the one study that I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to go there first. That study is, I think, the sort of launch pad for where I want to go tonight. Now, for those of you who are here from my talk on near-death experiences last year, this is going to be review, but the rest won't, so stick with me. So, there was a guy, his name is Michael Persinger, and he did experiments with what got editorialized as the God helmet. It's really called the Seren helmet. And essentially what this device did is it hooked up 4 little magnets to the sides of your head, right on your temporal lobe, which is roughly the top of your ear to an inch above your ear on both sides, about an inch back. It's like it's in the middle of your head, but that's roughly the location of it. And so he put this helmet on people. Hello. He put this helmet on people, and it was hooked up to a machine that was hooked up to a computer that had a specific program running that would send bursts of magnetic signals to that part of the brain. And it did something very specific. Now, Persinger's hypothesis was that you had 2 senses of self, 2 personal identities baked into each half of your head, right? Because you got 2 hemispheres of your head. And his theory that he was trying to prove was that you have a sense of self in each one. And so he was stimulating to the one side and getting it really excited, and then he would quickly switch and stimulate the other side, and that radical change would create this weird part of you that you're like seeing part of yourself. And more than half of the people who put that helmet on in this concrete room experienced what was called the sensed presence. They felt someone in the room with them, but when they looked around, they didn't see anyone there. And it would have been futile because they had blindfolds on anyway, but they didn't, they had an experience of someone else. And so his theory was that we have two separate senses of self. But something else happened in those experiments that was really cool. And this is why it got called the God helmet. Because in about 2% of cases, people didn't just experience a person with them. They thought it was God, right? So this was mostly on Catholic people. So they thought it was Jesus Christ in the room with them. And it wasn't a huge number. It was only 2% of the people in the study. But it wasn't zero. It wasn't zero. So it's like, what do you mean? You're in a concrete room with a helmet on, and you had a God moment. And so this sort of verified this sort of launched conversations about the relationship between the temporal lobe, and in particular epilepsy, and these mystical experiences. Now, people have known that there was a relationship between those things much before these experiments, but this is a laboratory setting, right? So, the evidence for relationship between temporal lobe epilepsy and mystical experiences goes far beyond what happens in the lab. We've got some great anecdotal evidence, and I'm going to share some of it with you soon, from Ellen White, who's the woman who is like a big name in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We've got stuff from Fyodor Dostoevsky, who documented 102 different episodes of epilepsy that he had, and then described them. And he's like, if he's not, if he isn't a reliable witness, I don't know what is. So this is one of the few things that I actually wrote down because I wanted to share it with you specifically. Because this is from his diary, right? Dostoevsky, as a result of his epileptic seizures, which later, it was like, okay, well, he had a form of epilepsy that's very similar to Ellen White and these things that are being created in the lab. This is what he said. And this, I think, will tie some things together for the rest of our conversation. He said, "For several instants, I experience a happiness that is impossible in an ordinary state, and of which other people have no conception. I feel full harmony in myself and in the whole world. And the feeling is so strong and sweet that for a few seconds of such bliss, I would give up 10 years of life, perhaps all life. I have felt that heaven descended to earth and swallowed me. I really attained God and was imbued with him. All of you healthy people don't even suspect what happiness is. That happiness that we epileptics experience for a second before an attack." So what are we supposed to do with that, right? That's as clear as it gets. And this is a person who, it's Dostoevsky, right? If it was just like a dude on the street, it'd be one thing. But this is a dude that a lot of people respect his opinions on. And he's stating it clearly. So there's a bit of history that I think is relevant to sort of anchor that idea to, that comes from William James. Now, William James is probably the most, it's hard to even put him in a category. He created the discipline of psychology. Before him, the concept of psychology was not a discipline, at least in the academic world. He literally wrote the textbooks while he was working at Harvard. And while he was at Harvard, he did a whole bunch of studies with graduate students. And the result of the series of experiments was a book titled The Varieties of Religious Experience. Really cool book. Can't even begin to go and talk about what was actually in it. But he found that after analyzing thousands of accounts of religious experiences, that there were 4 general traits that always applied. Now, this wasn't just your average run-of-the-mill religious experience. These were the ones that shook you to your core. The really important ones. And so the four main characteristics were, they were transient, which is a fancy word for short. They didn't last very long. They were noetic, which is another fancy word for saying they were important. They mattered. Not just a little. They were some of the most important things that ever occurred to you. They were passive experiences, which is to say, you were not the one having the experience, like you weren't driving. Something was occurring and you were there like, whoa, but you were not driving that car. And then the last was, they're ineffable, which is another fancy word for, it doesn't translate into language well. Like the experience is so grand that we don't have vocabulary to capture what's really happening. And this is what thousands of people report. So he wrote that book at the end of the 1800s. So, using that definition and some of the sort of more recent studies, what I'm going to try to do for you here tonight is present a hypothesis. I want to propose that experiments stimulating the temporal lobe demonstrate a causal link between the brain and experiences of God. That's what I'm trying to argue. I'm trying to argue that here. Now, there's two things that are radically important. I'm operating from two assumptions that you don't have to agree with, and if you don't, the rest of this isn't going to make any sense. And that's fine, but understand that these are the two assumptions that I'm operating on. Number one, the temporal lobe in the brain, which is something I'm going to describe more, is responsible for orienting us in space and time. It's one of its functions. It's not limited to that. It also has to do with auditory perception and other things. But that part of the brain is responsible for orienting us in space and time. And then number two, I have a very specific definition of God that I'm operating from, which is, again, this is an assumption, right? I'm operating from the assumption that's built into Hindu philosophy, which is that the sense of God is built into us and that we are that. The direct word that's from the Upanishads is Aham Brahmasi. I don't know how to say it right. I don't pronounce it right. Sandy will yell at me. But this idea that when people are saying that they're experiencing God, my argument is that they're experiencing a different form of self-awareness, a grand, extreme form that we are just now beginning to understand scientifically. Now, these are my assumptions. So, given that, oh wow, I got lots of time. Good. So, given that, you guys are in for a ride. Given that, what I want to work towards is a frame that is different than the way we normally think. And it's that our brains and our bodies are not creating our experience, they're limiting it in a really useful way. So essentially, using the Seren helmet experiment, what they did was they stimulated a part of the brain to the point where it started to malfunction. And then they started stimulating the other part. Now, this wasn't their conclusion, this is mine. But it seems like, because this is happening with epileptics too, the seizure is preventing that part of the brain from doing its job. Now, if the part of your brain that orients you in space and time stops doing its job, and you're still conscious for a few seconds before the rest of your epileptic seizure, which you kind of lose control of things, if you're still conscious for a couple seconds, you are aware of the fact that you're existing with no boundaries of time and space. That seems like a pretty reasonable way to describe an experience of God. You are a unity of all time and space That's what people are expressing. And they talk about it as being blissful. They talk about it as wonderful. But that seems like, that's my hypothesis. I'm there. And so now I'm going to try to reinforce that with from some couple different directions. So, shifting gears for a moment, and we're going to reach the same point, but we're talking about a different set of scientific studies now. So, there was a guy named Dr. Roland Griffith. I made to make sure I say it right. He's from Johns Hopkins, and he did a study in the last 10 years, I forget exactly, but it was with cancer patients. And I have no idea how he got this through an ethics committee. But what he did was he took 51 people who were diagnosed with cancer and self-reported depression and anxiety symptoms. And he gave them psilocybin. He gave them mushrooms, right? Psychedelic mushrooms. And somehow, again, this passed an ethics committee. I have no idea. Amazing, amazing feat of will on his part. But the results from that study were absolutely incredible. So I'm gonna just share a couple ideas from that and then tie it to the rest of what I was talking about. So, number one, 85% of people who were part of that study reported feeling better about their whole life a year later, right? They had measurements. They were done in double-blind, crossover trials. They were good, and they had these measurements. And then the same people later, a year later, reported quality of life improvement. These are cancer patients. And there's something about that experience that was transformative and good, and it improved their lives later. Now, the same group of people, the same 85%, were part of the set that at the time reported having a mystical experience as a result of that dose. Because they had these groups, and small percentage of the people in the study did not receive a dose high enough to give them a mystical experience, because they wanted to find out whether it was something to do with ingesting this kind of fungus, or whether it was the kind of experience that was induced by it. And it turned out there was a 1-to-1 correlation between the kind of, the experiences and the good results later. And this particular study had some weird, unbelievably good side effects. So one of the other ones, another 85% number somehow, 85% of the people in that study quit smoking, which is like a ridiculously high figure in terms of a medicine being able to contribute to anything. That's a huge number. Really weird, and they have no idea why. So why am I telling you all this? Well, it turns out that the Persinger study, where they measured sort of a tiny form of temporal lobe epilepsy in the lab, all of the people who were part of the group that identified an experience of God in the lab, all of those people, they brought them back in. They're like, wait a minute, we got to look at you. And they looked at their temporal lobes years later. And they found that there was a weird situation going on there. There was an anomaly in the way that their amygdala functioned as compared to the average person. So the amygdala is part of the temporal lobe. I told you the temporal lobe is like aisle 5 of the grocery store, right? Well, there's a couple really important things in there, and one of them is the amygdala. So the amygdala is the part of the brain responsible for the powerful emotional memories that you have. The extreme ones, not the little ones, but the ones that are associated with fear, terror, or ecstatic bliss and joy. And it turns out that your brain's highly specialized, right? So on the left side, you got good stuff. Happy, bliss, joy. the right side, fear or terror. And with all of the people in the Soren-Hellman experiment that reported experiences of God, the bridge between the two sides of the amygdala, which is like there's a channel where the one side gets to talk to the other side, and then another bridge going the other direction. So the sad part can talk to the happy part, and the happy part can talk to the sad part. The bridge became a one-way street in all of the people who had experiences of God in the lab. What does that mean? The people who are having experiences, let's assume equal stimulation. Assume that you're getting the same amount of fear and joy in your life. And your brain is talking to itself very comfortably, and information is traveling normally, and you're considered a normal, happy, healthy human. If you're one of these people, there's no loop. There's like all the things that make you scared feed into making you feel bliss and joy, and not the other way. So all of those people reported higher qualities of life. They scored lower in trait neuroticism, which is the thing that measures your sensitivity to depression, anxiety. It's not a surprise, but it happened. And so that was weird. And the people who did Roland Griffith did the same follow-up study with his patients. He's like, well, let me look at your amygdala. What's going on there? You had a profound religious experience with psilocybin. Amygdala also rearranged in the same way so that the conversation could only occur from the fear side to the happy side. Now, what does that mean? I'll give you sort of a direct example. We've all met those people who are just perfectly blissful in all moments. Like, they could be in the middle of a hurricane, and they'd be sitting in lotus posture, just floating along, like everything is fine, nothing hurts, nothing harms me, it's all brushing right off. And it turns out that pretty much everybody who's in this camp, everybody who's been in the situation where their amygdala only functions from one way to the other, operate like that as human beings. That's weird, but it turns out that whether you have this magical, extreme, godlike moment in the laboratory as a result of a helmet, or you eat a plant, either of those powerful experiences lead to lifelong transformations in your life. Unbelievably important experiences that people self-identify as top 3 most important things that ever occurred to them in their life. So the people in the psilocybin experience, they all said, all the people that had the experience, which was only 85% of the whole subject pool, but all the people in that 85% said that experience in the lab was top 3 most important thing in their entire life. On par with giving birth, getting married, stuff like that. So it's like, these are important things that we're able to create. And not only are we able to create them, but we're getting at least a tiny grip on what's actually occurring in those moments. So I want to talk now about meditation. Because it turns out that people have similar quality experiences in certain moments of serious meditations. Not all the time, but once in a while, people have these extreme moments, feeling a sense of unity and bliss, and they're creating it deliberately. So what's going on there? Is it the same as the psilocybin situation? Is it the same as the magnetic stimulation with the helmet situation? Is it different? Hard to say, but I think that there's a way to look at that I think makes sense. So here. I want to say it like this. And this, I have to sort of unpack this a little bit. When you live your life, when you're going through and doing stuff, everything you do, everything you look at, everything that you experience is creating new neural circuitry on top of what you've already got. So like, there's something going this way, think of a river, right? The more stuff that goes down that river, the more the water goes down that river, the deeper it gets, and that becomes your personality, that becomes your habits, right? We've got these neural pathways that we reinforce with our lives. This is a super oversimplification, but it's useful. Because essentially, what we do when we want to change our behavior, when we decide something, we create a new structure that inhibits other parts of our brains. We can't erase anything about us, right? So if you've got an addictive personality, right, you're addicted to cocaine for 25 years, that part of you never dies. But a new part of you develops and can hold it down, which is why triggers never go away for people. And so when people are meditating, they're creating structures inside their minds that shut down certain parts of their brains. Not completely, they don't die, but it's like, I'm going to push the pause button over here. I'm going to push the pause button over here. I'm going to try to just slow things down a little bit. And it certainly seems to me, based on the assumption that I already explained, that if we have a structure that inhibits some of the functioning of the temporal lobe, our relationship to time and space is going to change. We're inhibiting that part of our brain, and that part of the brain is limiting our experience in a specific way. We push the limit away and flood of experience. So, the third study that I want to talk about is directly up this alley, because there's different kinds of meditating. Does it matter? Do certain forms of meditation lead to these kinds of experiences more than others? Hard to say. Excuse me. Dr. Andrew Newberg wanted to test this. He was wondering what the relationship was between meditating and prayer and what happened in the brain. This is one of the first times people really took spiritual stuff and brought it into the lab. Andrew Newberg is one of the coolest dudes, as far as I'm concerned. And so what he did was he took some awesome Buddhist monks who were able to make it to samadhi quickly. So they have been doing this their whole life. This is something they're comfortable with. They can do that. They're there. And he put them in a machine. And the machine had ways of taking pictures that are too complicated for me to understand, let alone tell you about. But anyway, they took pictures, and those pictures showed that the amount of brain activity in this monk when he was meditating was extremely low as compared to a normal functioning human. He's like, I'm not done here. And so he took some hardcore nuns, and he had them pray, and he wanted to compare the results. And he was like, well, if he's doing that, what happens if you do that? The thing you do all the time. You've been doing this for 40 years too. What does it look like? Shockingly similar results. Slight changes in the details are too complicated to go into. But the point is, prayer, meditation, both had this effect of inhibiting most brain activity. It slowed everything down, including the temporal lobe, which, again, huge thing. One of the functions of which orients us in space and time. So we come to this conclusion from three different directions where slowing this part of the brain down has something to do with spirituality in either an enormous way or in sort of a minor way. Depending on what part of the temporal lobe gets shut down, changes different parts of your experience. And there's a lot more studies like this too. I picked three, the ones that seem to relay the point that I want to make the best. But there's other ones, right? So there were people who did studies into DMT, and there's a wonderful documentary about it called The Spirit Molecule. And that documentary spells out like the same story using a different chemical. And the basic idea is, with the chemical stuff, and I'm only going to go here for a little bit longer, the psilocybin and the studies that Timothy Leary did with LSD and the DMT stuff, all of those chemicals interact with serotonin in a way that we really don't understand. It interacts with the serotonin receptors, and the uptake of serotonin is staggered in a weird way. So, like, your antidepressants are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And if you took an antidepressant that only worked some of the time, it'd be kind of like LSD, DMT, psilocybin, etc. It's something like that. We really don't know, which is fascinating as far as I'm concerned. It's great for me to know that there's stuff that we don't really understand. So the last thing I want to go into before I give my theological explanation for all of this, or try, is the fact that near-death experiences produce the same thing as all of these other experiments and all of these other methods for generating mystical experiences. The numbers based on the way you're defining a mystical experience range from 60 to 80%. 60 to 80% of people who have a near-death experience report having an experience of God in their own language. And of the people who report that, the relationship between the two sides of the amygdala in their brain on MRIs taken 6 months to a year later consistently show the same thing, where this communication system between the two parts of the brain through the corpus callosum, or however you say that, this bridge, when it gets broken as a result of these mystical experiences, there's lifelong changes that improve people's quality of life for the rest of their life. I mean, the psilocybin case is fascinating. One of the things that they were able to measure is that, on average, there was a 15-point increase in trait openness of everybody in the study, of the people who had the mystical experiences. So trait openness is like being willing to try new experiences or accept new ideas and try them on before you dismiss them. Now, I'm not going to say that openness is like a good thing across the board, but there's clear, obvious, long-term changes happening from these mystical experiences that we can measure, but that doesn't mean we really understand them. So I want to step all the way back to where I started. And I want to focus on the one, as far as I'm concerned, the most important thing that I'm trying to share with you tonight, which is like a theory of existence, a theory of being, and the role that your body plays in experience. Because I think that once you adopt this other frame of reference, at least some of the time, it makes some of the things that occur in the neuroscience literature make a lot more sense. And that framework, that perceptual frame that I want to really pound home is, you are existence. You are a thing that experiences all things. And your body has a very specific job, which is to limit that experience in really important ways, right? Your visual faculty narrows down what you can see to the point where you're only really getting tools. That's not completely true, but it's close. It's like we see the right size for our hand to pick up. We hear the right things that might be big enough to hurt us. We smell the stuff that's either going to taste good or that's going to kill us. Our whole perceptual faculty is limiting what we know already exists. Like we know it's not a question that gamma rays and X-rays exist, but we don't perceive them. They're outside of the limit that our brains operate. Like we are creating these limits. These limits are part of us, and there's a reason for it, which is a theological, teleological thing. I don't know why, but that's the domain. Like you want the why, go there. You got to read the religious scriptures and derive something for yourself. But all these studies seem to reinforce the idea that when the temporal lobe is stimulated in a certain way and effectively inhibited, whether it's a chemical, whether it's a magnetic stimulation, whether it's you creating a structure via meditation, or, and this is where it's a speculative thing, any other form of mystical experience, when the part of you that's limiting time and space is shut down, turned off, or at least slowed down, you have an experience that, by all accounts, is divine. And it gets interesting because the temporal lobe is not just responsible for time and space, right? There's all these things in it. It's aisle 5 of the grocery store. It does time and space. It does memory. It does emotion. This is obviously an oversimplification, but like the hippocampus and the amygdala, those two structures, which are part of the temporal lobe, are totally critical if you want to have memories. And one of the things that's really important to think about is like, well, memory is assuming time and space, right? Because it was you, then, there. You don't have memories that don't have a location. So it's like the part of us that's creating time and space for our memories is the same part that you can shut down in the moment and have certain kinds of extreme experiences where you connect and feel unity to not just everyone and everything now, but everything and everything that ever was and everything that's ever going to be. Now, if that isn't an experience of God, I don't know what is. Certainly sounds like what people say. So, that's the heavy part. That's the heavy part. Now, I want to do something a little different. And I see Mary Jo already cringing. I like that. Yeah, I like that. So, I'm going to share what happened to me when I had an experience like this. And then what I want to do is open it up and see if anyone else would like to share an experience they've had that's of this magnitude. Because I think that it's important for us to understand that these kinds of things happen to almost everyone at some point in their lives. So for me, I was a sophomore in college. I had just changed my major. I said, psychology is stupid. I'm going to study philosophy. I know everything, and psychologists don't know anything, and so I know everything, and so I go home. I'm in this weird state of my life, and I start watching a movie by Will Smith called 7 Pounds. And I'm alone, right? This is a bad movie to watch alone. Don't do that. But I watch this movie. I'm sitting in my house all by myself. It's about 7 o'clock in the afternoon. It's in the middle of summer. And I finish this movie, and I'm not going to spoil the movie because I know some of you are going to be like, I need to go watch that movie now. But I get up, and I'm like in a daze, or I'm disoriented, and I immediately, like, first thing I do is go put my shoes on and just start walking. I'm like, I gotta go. And that's, like, I don't have a better way to describe, like, I was compelled to go. So I walk down the street, and I turn right, and I start walking towards the cemetery, right, where my family is all buried. So that's the place I always go. When I go for a walk or a run or anything, I always go there. And so I get this, I start rubbing my hand along the bush that's along the side of the road, and I have this, it feels like someone punched me in the face. It was just, poof. And I had the visual of this enormous tree of light, and that I was this little dot of light that sort of slowly fell into the roots of that giant tree. I was like, whoa, what's going on here, Will? Will Smith has really sent me off somewhere. What's going on? And the only word that I can say was, like, in bold-face print, maybe script, unity. Unity. That's all I felt. And it was like 5 seconds. But it was like, whoa. And, I had to stop, and I was like, am I still here? Like, what's going on? So I kept walking, right? This wasn't the end. I thought, naive me, that was all that would happen. So I make it to the cemetery, and I go to the place where my father's side of the family is all clustered together. And I don't know what overcame me, but I laid down on the grave of my grandfather. And the sun is, like, almost going down, but it's pretty bright. And I'm laying there, and I close my eyes, and I teleport to my funeral. And I'm in the casket at my funeral, and there's no one there. And I'm like, I, like, sit up out of the casket, like, hello? Hello? And as a result of this experience, I realized that I needed to radically change who I was so that I wasn't dying and not helping other people. It wasn't impacting other people. And I can talk about the results of that for a long time, but all of that incredible set of situations, I know that since that moment, since I touched that bush, negative experiences don't have the same sting as they used to. When people tell me bad news, when I'm in a bad situation, it simply doesn't hurt like it used to. And that was not something that I did. It was something that happened to me in that moment. And sure, I've capitalized on it and reinforced it and done more things, but, like, this experience that I've been describing, that we have evidence to demonstrate that this happens for other people, that happened to me after watching 7 Pounds. So, he's not paying me to advertise, by the way. So, I can keep going, but I really want to pause for a moment so that I can just drink a whole lot of water and hear about someone else's, if anyone else has had experiences of this caliber, and please, Dennis. Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect transition to where I kind of wanted to end us tonight, which was like the relationship between orientation or attention and limitation. You know, our eyes are a wonderful sort of way to describe what our attention seems to do. Where, you know, we've got a very small portion of our vision is really, really good, really high definition, right? We've got really good vision when we look at something straight on. And then everything around it is like, meh, it's something, but it's not super precise. And like by analogy, that's effectively what our attention is too. And it seems like when we have these kinds of transcendental experiences, these experiences where time and space disappear, what we are paying attention to no longer has a referent. We don't have a specific thing that we're looking at anymore because we're so accustomed. We're so used to thinking in terms of, well, this time and space must be present as part of this experience. And what these mystical moments seem to do is bust out of that prerequisite, right? So in philosophy, it used to be taken for granted that time and space were a priori, which was a fancy way of saying before experience, right? It means these are categories that are built into being a human being. And that was a truism for hundreds of years. Everyone assumed that time and space, that's just something that's real. And we're starting to begin moving a little closer, and the scientific literature is starting to mount up, and the evidence is getting really overwhelming that it's like, no, those categories are not what we think they are. And our ability to pay attention to stuff is not what we thought it was. It's something so powerful. It's something so different. And the boundaries on that are so infinite. Like, what we're capable of experiencing is so far beyond what we ordinarily describe. You know, it's worth thinking about. And I'm going to open it up for two more things. And I have one more sentence that I want to make sure everybody gets. Then we'll let the two of you kind of wrap us up. But there's a quote that I love. I absolutely love. And you know, I've talked a lot about some heavy-duty psychedelics tonight, and I have to like point out that I'm not encouraging, in any sense of the word, for you to go seek out like controlled substances and play with them. I'm using them as examples, and just to reinforce that, you know, Carl Jung, who is somebody who is an enormous, let's call it a role model for me. He said, and I quote, "Beware of wisdom you did not earn." And so it's like, you're going to open some doors up. Be sure you know that you're ready to fight and face, not just face, you're ready to fight whatever's on the other side of those doors. Because, you know, the other thing that I didn't mention, because it's less flowery, in the psilocybin experiments, 10% of the research participants went to hell, not to heaven. You know, 10% of them went to hell. And so anyway. Please.
So you haven't talked about quantum physics at all in non-local communication, and I'm wondering if you saw in any of the literature anything related to tying quantum physics into what you were looking at. And it might be out there, and you just that wasn't the point of your.
I'm sure that somebody who's much smarter than me has tied the concepts of quantum entanglement into these experiences and made a synthesis of how our experiences can be tied to all possible things through quantum entanglement, like the relationship between our experiences and all possible things using light as a fundamental fabric. There's an argument there, so I totally see what you're saying. Like there's a thread there to follow that takes you somewhere, but I don't know, and I haven't read anyone that does. So,
Just curious.
makes sense, but I don't know. And Sandy, you're in charge.
Okay. And to be clear, I have a few things. So to be clear, what you mentioned about in philosophy, this concept of time and space is your experience. This is Western philosophy.
Thank you.
Because in yoga philosophy, these experiences are described so thoroughly, and it's so impressive because, I'm studying the yoga aphorisms in the last few months more intensely. So I've read through it quite a couple times now and really thinking about it, letting it sit with me. And it's so beautiful because what you're bringing ties so well to what's in the aphorisms and in the commentary of what some of the better commentaries are. So I love it because it ties in. In fact, in the version I have in my hand right now, there's even a clear-cut time distinction of this is what it's like if you're in this state of meditation versus this state of concentration, and it times it, right? So I wanted to ask you, what is the amount of time is it in that study as to when the different sides are stimulated? How do we know that they had only a few seconds of this experience before the epileptic seizure? Could you give me a little bit more on that?
Yes. So I have to treat those as two separate questions. So in the Seren helmet experiments, the God helmet studies, this was roughly a 2-hour-long procedure that the people would experience. So the machine was on their head, and it would be stimulating the right side for 30 minutes. Then they would have the same signal on both sides of the brain, and right at the 30-minute mark, right when they clicked on the uniform stimulation, there was a between 2 and 8 second window where something might occur if it was going to. And then when they stopped doing the uniform stimulation and only stimulated the left side towards the end of the experiment, there was another small pocket. So it was over a 2-hour period, there was 2 pockets of, between 2 and 8 seconds where the probability of a special moment, an experience that people would report as significant, would occur.
Wow.
So it was right when they would, make the change that they were deliberately making. So that's the one. And what's the other question? Sorry.
Well, so it was, what did I ask? Time of stimulation and time of experience.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so all we have is anecdotal evidence right now about the time duration before epileptic seizures and the experience associated with them. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence, but that's all we have. And, I'll refer to Dostoevsky on this one, because he recorded, again, 102 of his epileptic seizures. And in his words, roughly 3 seconds before the attack. And that would be the whole experience, would be 3 seconds long. So it's very short.
I'm sorry, are you saying Dostoevsky?
Fyodor Dostoevsky, or I'm sure I'm butchering his name. Yeah, the Russian novelist, yeah.
It was an initiate.
There we go. Yeah, the Russian novelist. Yes, Al, and you're going to be taking us home.
You've emphasized the brain as the center of religious experience tonight, but do you think other parts of the body are capable of generating religious experience also?
I believe there's just about anything is possible at this point, but as far as what has been measured in the central nervous system that's going in focused around the heart center or in the in the solar plexus area, and the relationship between those parts of the nervous system and the mind, that stuff I don't know enough about to talk about. So I'm sure that that's a thing. I know that there's a whole brain down here in your stomach, but I don't know anything about it. So I'll defer to ignorance. All right. I keep saying it's the last thing.
This will
finalize it.
All right. Take us
So,
away.
Knowing or collecting and observing and processing everything that you just shared, like what would you like to see happen with all that we know now? Like where do you anticipate?
For like all of humanity?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many studies, there's so many things that we're unpacking, we're uncovering, we're discovering. What do we do with all that now? Like
I want to, okay, so I'm going to scaffold my answer on a couple different things. So the basic idea is I want our values to shift a little, and I'd like the trait openness to be more acceptable as part of like our society. I think the more we're allowing to happen, the better. And I know that that's a political statement, so I won't go any further there, but it starts there. I think more openness towards possible research opportunities. So like once the values shift, then ethics committees are a little more like willing to let new ideas emerge. And I think that the funding committees will be more interested in supporting studies like these. It will be easier, hopefully, in the future, if openness becomes something that's cultivated, that we'll get more studies like this. And we're still in the phase of gathering experiences, right? So as far as I'm concerned, I think the analogy is you can make something with like zoology, right? A comparison. When it comes to understanding mystical experiences, we are still, like, we just landed on a new continent, and we're kind of collecting data, like, oh, wow, what's that thing? Flat-billed platypus, sweet. What do we do with that? I don't know what category it fits in yet, but, like, I think, as we get more information and the evidence begins to mount up in the scientific world, these things will change and we'll get more opportunities to get even more information. And the final goal, as far as I'm concerned, has to do with treating each other better. I think that the more kinds of experiences like this that people have, and the more these kinds of experiences are encouraged in people, the better social relationships are going to be, the better we can treat each other, and the concept of brotherhood, which is the first object of this society, the more we can actually live that out because we treat each other as beings that are capable of having these experiences just like us. We start to see each other as these infinite beings and not as these, oh, you're wearing the wrong color hat,
That was the great failure of Hudson's Bay, was that he never realized the universal brotherhood of mankind, and that he said in the alcohol prophecies that it will be realized in a very age.
So we'll end with that. Thank you all very much for being here. Oh, one more thing. Please listen to this.